So if your recipe ever calls for beaten egg or to beat eggs or any other ingredient, there's a few different things you can do that with. You can use a fork, which is what a lot of us end up beating eggs with. You can use a whisk. If you have a stand mixer, generally if it says beat, you want to use your paddle attachment. This is a paddle attachment and it beats air into whatever you're mixing. A piece of equipment just about any house needs is a blender. There are a lot of options for blenders and you can spend as much or as little as you want to. These are two different examples. The one on the left is a KitchenAid. It's in the $70 range. The one on the right is a Waring commercial blender that's in the $800 range. If you are the type of person that makes smoothies every day or likes to make ice-based drinks, investing in a blender is definitely not a bad thing to do. Commercial blenders are often very helpful because you can replace individual parts of them, whereas the household blenders often aren't able to replace parts. So if you know that you're going to be using a blender for a long period of time, it may be better to invest in a commercial blender because you'll break household blenders more often and in the long term end up spending just as much money. If your recipe says to combine, generally combining is working with dry ingredients. So you might be combining cornmeal and salt and mixing that together. Sometimes it's for things like trail mix where you're mixing together things like nuts and seeds and chocolate chips and dried fruit. So combining is basically taking two or more ingredients and putting them into the same container, and then generally you mix it up. To cream is to beat solid fat, like shortening or butter, and sugar together to create a light creamy texture. This is a method of leavening recipes, meaning it helps it rise. The easiest way to do this is with a stand mixer. So as you can see, we're adding sugar into butter, and you whip it together until it's light and fluffy. The color needs to lighten. When you add eggs to a recipe that calls for creaming, you add them one at a time after the butter and sugar becomes light and fluffy. You can also cream with a hand mixer. It's important to note, however, that hand mixers aren't designed to stand the kind of abuse that a stand mixer does, so be careful because it's easy to break your equipment. Finally, you can cream with a wooden spoon, but historic recipes calling for creaming say to do this for up to an hour. So it's not really recommended to do any recipe that calls for creaming with a wooden spoon. Just use a mixer. The next term that we're going to talk about is called cutting in, or to cut in. And this is something that you're going to do with things like biscuits or pastry dough, and it distributes the fat throughout it so that your ending item is very flaky. So there's a few different tools that you can do this with. The first of which is a pastry blender. This is great for people if you have really hot hands or if you make biscuits quite often. And you're just going to take the pastry blender and break up any of the solid fat in there. The solid fat that you can use is either shortening or butter or margarine, and you just go through and the pastry cutter will distribute the margarine or butter. The pastry cutter is not my favorite tool though because it only does one thing and it's a little difficult to clean. So I'll give you some alternatives for this particular thing. If you have hot hands, that can melt the butter and make it work into the flour more than you want. So you can use a fork and it does pretty much the same thing. If you want to, you can even use 2 forks to make it a little faster. Or, if you're willing to work quickly, the easiest way to do this is with your hands. You can either work it with your fingertips, breaking up the butter or shortening chunks, or you can lift it up and rub it like this, and that breaks up your chunks. When making items like angel food cake or folding into things to whip cream, the term that you'll use for this is fold. So what we're going to do here is fold some powdered sugar into some whipped cream, and your goal is to not lose any of the volume and not lose any of the bubbles. So you use a down, up, and around motion and rotate the bowl as you go around, and this way you don't lose the volume that you've worked so hard to create. So our next term is to knead, and kneading uses the dough hook. If you're using a stand mixer, this is the easiest way to do it that requires the least effort. The dough hook will automatically knead your bread so that you don't necessarily have to do it on the counter. This helps develop the elastic gluten structure that lets dough rise. The other way to knead dough is by hand. And by doing that, you're pressing and turning and folding with your hands until it becomes smooth and elastic. This smooth elastic structure is what allows the yeast to blow bubbles in the dough. The term mix means combining ingredients by stirring or beating them. You can do this with a wire whisk, which helps you incorporate things like eggs a little more easily. So you just mix it until it's combined. You can also mix with a wooden spoon or a plastic spoon. The function of these is the same, it just depends on what material that they're made of. To sift as a mixing term is usually used to combine dry ingredients. It's a little bit quicker of a way to combine ingredients. You can also use a strainer for this. If you don't want to buy a sifter, buy a strainer and it will fulfill several different purposes in your kitchen. So our next term is to stir, and you can stir with a whisk or a spoon. So stirring is pretty much interchangeable with mixing, so a lot of times you'll just see those terms used wherever it's convenient. But it's to use a spoon or a wire whisk with a circular motion. Another piece of equipment that's important to address right here though is a mixing bowl. These come in a glass or plastic or metal, but I prefer metal because they're easier to wash, they don't melt, and they don't stain. They also don't break, so that becomes very important for your kitchen. So our next cooking term is to toss. Generally, you're going to toss things like salads using salad tongs or your hands. But other things you can toss are things like wings and barbecue sauce. So another piece of equipment that we're going to be working with is a hand mixer. Hand mixers are good for smaller operations. It's just not a good idea to use it with things like butter because a lot of times the motor will get bogged down. But what we're doing is we're going to whip some cream. So our cooking term here is to whip, and here we go. The term whip involves incorporating air into a mixture. You can whip cream, you can whip butter, you can whip pretty much anything to make it light and fluffy. You can also whip with a stand mixer or a whisk. So you know your cream is whipped when it holds a point.